feet, down 2.5. Picking up some dust. Down 1/2. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Landing men on the moon was a singular achievement that established the 20th century as the age of aerospace. It was the culmination of nearly a decade of work by hundreds of thousands of Americans. A national effort called Project Apollo.
Roger, the EVA is progressing beautifully. I believe it's setting up the flag now.
But what drove Project Apollo more than anything else was not the desire to explore another world. It was the determination to defeat an adversary here on Earth, the Soviet Union.
People forget the enormous antagonism between the Soviet Union and the U.S. at that time. When President Kennedy set the goal to put a man on the moon before the decade was out, that became a battle in the Cold War.
The Cold War pitted Western democracies, led by the United States, against the Soviet Union. It was a battle for hearts and minds, waged with technology and science as a measure of power. In 1957, the first salvo of the Cold War's contest in space was launched by the Soviets on top of a massive rocket.
Until 2 days ago, that sound had never been heard on this Earth. It's a report from man's farthest frontier, the radio signal transmitted by the Soviet Sputnik, the first man-made satellite as it passed over New York earlier today.
I'll never forget Friday, October 4th, 1957. Our neighbors and my parents and I gathered out in the backyard, and I remember that no one said anything. We all knew where to look. And then it appeared, coming over the trees, this star silently moving against the background of all the fixed stars. We went back in the house after it was out of sight and asked my parents, why were some of them crying? Because I thought this was the most magnificent thing I could imagine. And they said, we're crying because it means the Soviet Union could drop a nuclear egg on us anytime they want.
Sputnik was pretty terrifying because it meant that the calculus of the Cold War had really changed, and that nuclear destruction seemed a lot more likely.
Russia's getting into space really bothers me.
We are headed downhill to the status of a second-rate world power.
If Russia wins dominance of this completely new area, well, I think the consequences are fairly plain. Probable Soviet world domination.
In 1957, when Sputnik was launched, I was teaching thermodynamics at West Point. And I remember the impact that it had on me because I thought this is a game changer. I was dismayed by the Russians being first.
Weeks after Sputnik, America's effort to launch its first satellite blew up on the launch pad.
The Americans utterly failed. It looked like the Soviets could do nothing wrong and we could do nothing right.
It wasn't until 4 months after Sputnik that the United States finally put its own satellite into orbit. Then, in July 1958, the United States created NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration.
NASA is a direct response to the Sputnik crisis that people felt in the winter of 1957 and 1958. We had a sense that we needed to catch up.
In April 1959, NASA chose 7 men to become America's first astronauts.
One of the first questions came about was, how are we going to beat the Soviet Union to putting the first man in space? And so NASA developed the Mercury program. It was 1 man in orbit. That was its fundamental objective.
To put a man in orbit would require rockets and spacecraft. To build them, NASA turned to the American aviation industry.
NASA provided the guidance, but it was industry that did the work. McDonnell Douglas, Rocketdyne, North American, Boeing, all of them have been central to the space history of the United States.
McDonnell Aircraft, known for its jet fighters, won the contract to build the Mercury Crew capsule.
McDonnell really was the pioneer in creating a human spacecraft. It was working with the NASA engineers to develop something that didn't exist before. You needed to have an environmental control system, you needed to have a cockpit. So McDonnell became a really critical contractor for NASA in the early space race.
In April 1961, as the U.S. was preparing to send a man into space, the Soviet Union shocked the world by getting there first.
Man had his first great success in space when the Russians pushed a man across the threshold. He was Yuri Gagarin, the first to orbit the Earth. It was the propaganda coup of the year.
This is the reality that confronted the newly elected president, John F. Kennedy.
Kennedy came into office knowing very little about space and basically caring very little about space. The flight of Yuri Gagarin changed that. Kennedy saw the world reaction to Gagarin's achievement. Here's the Soviet Union again doing something that the whole world admired.
Then, on May 5th, 1961, the United States was finally ready to launch its first astronaut, Alan Shepard, into space.
Shepard's flight was not as path-breaking as Yuri Gagarin's flight. Yuri Gagarin orbited Earth. Alan Shepard's flight was just a up-down trajectory. But it was such a confidence booster after such a string of failures.
Fuel is go, 2.5G.
Shepard's 15-minute flight, short as it was, gave the Kennedy administration the success it needed to talk about a grander vision for Americans in space.
And Kennedy decided that there was nothing more important than figuring out how to get the United States where it belonged in space, which was in the lead, and find, and I quote, a space program which promises dramatic results in which we could win.
And what the Kennedy administration proposed would launch the largest scientific and technical mobilization in American history.
We shall send to the moon, 240,000 miles away, a giant rocket on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth, and do all this, and do it right, and do it first. Before this decade is out, then we must be bold.
It was a promise to outspend, outbuild, outdream the Soviets, to prove American superiority by being first to the moon. President Kennedy's resolve was shared by NASA's astronauts.
We were Cold War warriors. It was an enormous challenge, not just for the people that flew, but for everybody. There were 400,000 Americans that worked on that program, and they all were dedicated, and they all wanted to win. That was the key. We win, they lose.
To win, the Kennedy administration had an asset waiting in the wings. The man who had been the chief rocket engineer for Nazi Germany. In the closing days of World War II in Europe, with Nazi Germany on the brink of collapse, the armies of the United States and the Soviet Union were advancing into German territory.
The Third Reich had many of the best scientists in the world, and we wanted them. Not only did we, America, want them, but we had to have them. Otherwise, the Soviets would get them.
The biggest prize was Wernher von Braun. He had designed and developed the world's first ballistic missile, the V-2 rocket.
Another launching, with the great weapon leaping 65 miles skyward, then reaching 3,000 miles an hour.
Germany launched more than 3,000 of them, targeting London, Antwerp, and other cities. But it was not the destructive power of rockets that had first sparked the fascination of Wernher von Braun. Since boyhood, he had been obsessed with space travel and dreamed of trips to the moon and to Mars. The rise of the Nazi regime gave von Braun an opportunity to further his ambitions. Now, in the spring of 1945, with his nation on the verge of surrender, he was the object of a manhunt by both American and Soviet forces.
Von Braun was a very calculating person. So he moved his team and his drawings all the way from Prussia to Bavaria so he could surrender to the United States. And he told the briefing officer, I've chosen to come with the United States because it will allow me to go to Mars.
Von Braun understood that he had found a powerful new patron. The one-time enemy was now an invaluable ally.
People thought the Nazis are finished, they're gone, we're not worried about them anymore, we're worried about the communists.
Von Braun and more than 100 members of his team were taken to the United States, where they resumed work on the V-2 in the New Mexico desert. While he was helping America arm itself against its new enemy, the Soviet Union, von Braun was also advancing his own dream of rocketing to the moon and to Mars. On October 24th, 1946, a V-2 rocket was launched with a movie camera on board. These are the first pictures ever taken from space. By the 1950s, von Braun had become the popular face of American space exploration, appearing in 3 Walt Disney television specials.
I believe a practical passenger rocket could be built and tested within 10 years.
As the space race heated up in the 1960s, the Kennedy administration turned to von Braun to help America beat the Soviets to the moon. Von Braun was the chief architect of the new rocket Kennedy was counting on, a rocket powerful enough to break free of Earth's gravity and launch astronauts to the moon. It was named the Saturn V. For the aerospace industry, the job of executing von Braun's vision would present challenges on an unprecedented scale. The rocket, taller than a 30-story building, had 3 stages. Stage 1 was made by the Boeing Company. Stage 2, North American Aviation. And Stage 3, the Douglas Aircraft Company. 3 major contractors, each supplied by thousands of subcontractors. The Saturn V had more than 3 million parts, making up some 700,000 components. Engines, fuel injectors, and turbopumps from Rocketdyne, telemetry and guidance systems from IBM, gyroscopes and sensors from Honeywell. The Saturn V would be the most complex machine ever built.
Each one of those parts has to meet a tremendous number of individual specifications and requirements to make sure it does its job, that one part. And then all those parts have to come together, and you've got to make sure that as each one of them does its individual job, that they're also allowing the other adjacent part to do its job, and they all have to work together without fail.
Wernher von Braun and his team had always had near total control of rocket building. But the astonishing complexity of the Saturn V meant they were now forced to cooperate with industry.
When the rockets got to the Marshall Space Flight Center, the Germans would take them apart in order to make sure that industry had done the job the right way, because their attitude was, these are pupils, they're just learning. And Jim Webb, who was the NASA administrator, called in Wernher von Braun and he said, you've got to trust industry. You've got to quit taking these rockets apart. Just accept them from the factory. Von Braun knew the conversation was coming, so he reached into his back pocket and he pulled out a rag and waved it in Webb's face and says, this is what we find in the rocket. The workmanship isn't up to our standards. It was a great cultural fight between the old guard that was accustomed to doing things in-house and industry, which was having to take on a larger and larger share of NASA.
The challenges of managing Project Apollo were not limited to the design and construction of the Saturn V. The crew capsule, the lunar lander, guidance, communication, and life support systems. Much of the technology had to be invented. And getting it all built would require the mobilization of industry on a scale not seen since World War II. At its height, Project Apollo employed more than 400,000 people in every part of the country. George Miller managed NASA's Office of Manned Spaceflight.
When you have 400,000 people working on one project, you got to make sure they all know what project they're working on. And that's a real challenge all by itself.
It's extraordinarily complicated because it's decentralized. At one point, there were more than 20,000 private contractors involved in building systems for Apollo and its components. And that's a lot of different players to try to keep track of things.
It was the extraordinary logistical and technical complexity of Project Apollo that made it vulnerable to human error. In 1966, NASA selected the crew for Project Apollo's first manned test flight, which became known as Apollo 1. The plan was for 3 astronauts to orbit the Earth for 14 days.
Astronauts were fashioned as heroes. But this is an inherently dangerous enterprise. The risks of failure were quite high.
As far as we're concerned, it's a success if all 3 of us get back.
40-year-old Gus Grissom would command the mission. He was one of the original 7 astronauts. Ed White, 36, had taken the first American spacewalk. Roger Chaffee, 31, had not yet flown in space. Grissom, White, and Chaffee would be the first crew to test the new spacecraft designed to bring the Apollo astronauts to the moon. North American Aviation was the principal contractor for the spacecraft, known as the Command and Service Module. Dale Myers was the program manager.
We had 10,000 people working on the Apollo Command and Service Module, and those are the people reporting to me. It seemed like an important goal for the country, and I think everybody on the program got that idea.
10,000 people building something of extraordinary complexity to take the Apollo astronauts to the moon. But during months of testing, NASA had discovered problems in several systems in the Apollo Command Module, problems that were widely reported in the press.
Gus, do you expect there are going to be a goodly number of slips and pre-launch delays before you do get off?
Well, I think we've had them. The spacecraft systems all look pretty good to us now. They've been through the checkout at North American and have gone through initial series down at the Cape. And as soon as we get it out of the altitude chamber, I think that a good portion of our problems are over.
There was a natural tendency on the part of the public to expect things to go perfectly. But we understood that this was a research and development program, that things could happen, bad things could happen.
On January 27, 1967, less than a month before the scheduled launch of the mission, the crew went to the launch pad to run critical pre-flight tests.
Roger, senior power counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, senior power.
The tests took several hours. At 5:40 p.m., the astronauts had problems with their communication system.
How are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 3 buildings? I can't hear that message saying. All right.
And then, at 6:31 p.m., something went terribly wrong.
This is Peter Jennings at ABC News in New York. The 3 astronauts for America's first manned Apollo spaceflight have been killed.
An electrical spark apparently shot out and ignited the 100% oxygen in the cabin that they were breathing as in a real spaceflight.
The Cape was in complete disarray. A lot of the people that had been working on rockets had been involved in failures, but not in failures involving human lives.
I went directly to the Cape, and I saw the wives of all the astronauts and really had a difficult time. I knew the astronauts and I knew their wives. Oh, it was terrible.
And we commit his body to the ground, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
Not long before the fire, Gus Grissom had written these words about the dangers of space travel. There will be risks, and sooner or later, inevitably, we are going to run head-on into the law of averages and lose somebody. I hope this never happens, but if it does, I hope the American people won't feel it is too high a price to pay for our space program. In the wake of the fire that killed 3 American astronauts, the Apollo manned flight schedule was put on hold. NASA appointed Frank Borman and 8 others to a review board to investigate the fire.
Well, the inside of the spacecraft was charred beyond recognition. We spent several months trying to find out exactly what caused it. We think there was an insulation problem with some electrical wires near Gus Grissom's foot down the lower part of the spacecraft that arced and started the fire. We had overlooked the fact that in 100% oxygen, almost anything burns. And we had allowed too much flammable equipment to get into the spacecraft. So it was a real burned out hulk.
Almost 6 years had passed since President Kennedy had committed the nation to sending a man to the moon by the end of the decade. But the nation had changed. Kennedy had been assassinated. The United States was bogged down in a war in Southeast Asia. Protests against it were growing. America's expansive dreams and ambitions were being questioned, and Project Apollo was no exception.
The Apollo fire, it was a disaster, both internally and externally. You have to ask, well, why did you have the problem? And it was simply because we believed that we understood what we were doing, and then discovered we didn't really.
There were recriminations everywhere. This was really a wake-up call to everyone involved that perhaps things were being pushed a little too fast. And with the Apollo 1 fire, everyone kind of had to take a step back and stop and ask what had gone wrong and what needed to happen to make sure that this wasn't going to happen again.
The investigation by Borman and the review board revealed that serious mistakes had been made in the design and construction of the Apollo command module.
I think we all knew it was a dangerous business, so it was unreasonable to expect that we wouldn't have a problem, but I don't think any of us expected to have a problem on the ground.
The review board concluded that NASA had failed to properly oversee the work of North American aviation, and that this was a reflection of a broader problem. NASA had done a poor job of coordinating the huge number of contractors working on Project Apollo, and of integrating all the different systems they were designing.
And Jim Webb, who was the NASA administrator, made a phone call to the chief executive officer of Boeing and said, we need help. We need help with systems integration. We just need more people who are experienced systems analysts. And Boeing had that capability.
For the past 8 years, much of it working in secret, Boeing had been the main contractor for the Minuteman missile system. It had overseen the work of numerous other contractors and the production of nearly 2,000 missiles, ready to be launched at a moment's notice.
Their technique grew out of the Air Force ballistic missile program. Boeing, they're very, very good at making parts fit together and work together in concert. And if you can do that, you can gain control of very large technological systems.
In 1967, soon after the Apollo 1 fire, NASA and Boeing initiated a program called Apollo Technical Integration and Evaluation, or Apollo TIE.
The Apollo TIE program was designed to get the various parts and pieces coming from different suppliers all to work together. It is a classic piece of large-scale integration.
Boeing's responsibility would be to coordinate the work of the Apollo contractors. The company assigned some 2,000 people to the task.
You got one subsystem, another subsystem, you put them together, you want to make sure that they work according to expectations. Learning how to do that was the greatest organizational challenge that the United States faced with respect to Project Apollo.
NASA resumed work on manned missions in April 1968, more than a year after the Apollo 1 fire.
NASA and Boeing, in an advisory role, helped us go through every system and make sure it was as reliable as it could possibly be done.
Things changed dramatically. With the new management, I had enormous confidence. People make a difference. Managers make a difference.
But Project Apollo now had just 14 months to fulfill the late President Kennedy's pledge to put men on the moon by the end of the decade. Nearly 50 years since the end of the space race, many have forgotten that the first manned mission to the moon was Apollo 8. NASA scheduled Apollo 8 to fly in early 1969. The original mission was to have 3 astronauts orbit the Earth for 10 days. It would be commanded by Frank Borman. But the mission changed. The Central Intelligence Agency told NASA that the Russians were about to go to the moon.
That was a forcing function, there's no question about it. I was told that we were going to try to do it in December because we wanted to beat the Russians. And I said, that's fine with me, let's do it.
George Miller sent out a letter to all of us contractor people that were involved in the Apollo program saying, what do you think about going to the moon with Apollo 8? Is it ready? Are we reliable enough to do it? And Boy, I spent a lot of hard thinking about that issue. And got all my top guys together. We really worked hard on whether we were ready to go. Looked at all the data, decided, yes, we were ready to go.
The 6-day mission, with its crew of Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, atop a Saturn V rocket, was scheduled to lift off just days before Christmas in 1968.
The mission was to circumnavigate the moon. In other words, go to the moon, go into orbit around the moon, and then fire the service module to come home. Pretty special mission. A lot of things had to work right. We, of course, held our breath. Here we were going a long way into space, so we had to make it right. And that's what that 2 years after the fire was all about.
I never really sat down and tried to calculate the odds of getting back. I know Bill Anders said he thought that maybe 30% chance we wouldn't get back. I don't know. I was convinced I was coming back or I wouldn't have gone.
Wernher von Braun's massive rocket, the most complex machine ever built, had never been launched with people on board.
Apollo 8 was a really bold decision on the part of NASA. The fundamental decision was made to send a human crew to the moon on the Saturn V.
No American or Russian had traveled further than 850 miles from the Earth. The crew of Apollo 8 would be attempting a journey of nearly 250,000 miles.
The Saturn V was an enormous vehicle. I remember getting out of the elevator and walking over the catwalk into the spacecraft. It was awe-inspiring just to look down and see how high up you were before it ever started.
An estimated 200,000 people converged on the Space Center to witness the launch.
This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control. We are still go at this time. T-minus 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. The engines are on. 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have liftoff. Liftoff at 7:51 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
It kind of hung there, you'd say, is it really going? And it was very slow and very majestic in lifting off the launch pad. It was just a remarkable experience.
A machine of that size, of that scope, working perfectly, unbelievable. The noise was overwhelming and a lot of vibration back and forth. But the second stage smoothed out. As soon as you got past the speed of sound, it became quite a pleasant ride.
After a 3-day journey, Apollo 8 entered lunar orbit on Christmas Eve. From their spacecraft, Borman, Lovell, and Anders saw something no one had ever seen before. Planet Earth, alone in the vastness of space.
Oh my God, look at that picture over there. Wow, that's pretty. You got a color film, Jim? Hand me a roll of color quick, will you? Oh man, that's great. Where is it? Quick. Just grab me a color. A color exterior.
As they orbited the moon, the astronauts read the first 10 verses of the Book of Genesis. Hundreds of millions of people around the world watched or listened to the broadcast.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light.
You think of 1968, the political assassinations of Martin Luther King, of Robert Kennedy, urban riots in the United States, the endless conflict in Vietnam. To have the year ended on this kind of magic moment, certainly in the United States, put a very positive end to what had been a horrible year.
And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
I remember we got all kinds of telegrams after the flight. And the one that impressed me the most was, "Thank you, Apollo 8. You saved 1968."
We copy you down, Eagle.
On July 20th, 1969, Apollo 11 landed 2 American astronauts, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, on the surface of the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The United States had beaten the Soviet Union in the space race. The moon landing was a singular achievement for both America and for humanity at large. But for NASA, the question became, where do we go from here?
5, 4, we've gone for main engine start. We have main engine start. America's first space shuttle.
It was more than a decade before NASA would again capture the public's imagination with the launch of the first space shuttle in 1981. The shuttle was the first reusable spacecraft. Launched as a rocket, the winged vehicle glided back to Earth.
2, 1, science and supplies to the space station.
Starting in 1998, the space shuttle began the mission it was designed for, facilitating the construction of the International Space Station, or the ISS. The shuttle made 37 trips over more than a decade, hauling components, cargo, and crew to the ISS.
This is Mission Control Houston. As you can see, we're seeing live video from the International Space Station. There is Commander Chris Ferguson greeting Commander Andrei Borisenko.
The primary builders of the ISS were Russia and the United States, no longer competitors, but collaborators in space. The space station is made up of more than 30 major components, from laboratories to habitation modules to solar arrays, all joined together in space.
It is one of the great engineering achievements of all time. And Boeing was the systems integrator. Boeing made sure that when you plugged in the Russian modules with the US modules and the nodes in between, that they didn't catch fire, or that they didn't start to send errant signals to each other.
The ISS is where astronauts are learning how to survive for prolonged periods in space. What is learned here will make possible the trip to our next destination in the solar system, Mars. A journey to Mars will be a round trip of at least 70 million miles and could take longer than 2 years. A mission so long and so ambitious that its challenges would dwarf those of Apollo. On the most basic level, the human body is not designed to survive for long periods in a microgravity environment.
We have bone loss, which we can now control. We have muscle wasting, which we can kind of control. The immune system gets degraded in space. So we see the human system react to the microgravity environment. We want to use space station to make sure that there's not a problem when we're going distances as far as Mars for 2 or 3 years, that the human body will not have any detrimental effects from the journey.
A voyage to Mars will require a rocket even more powerful than the Saturn V that took men to the moon.
They're like, are you working on a Mercedes-Benz? Like, what is a SLS? Like, what is that? And I have to tell them it's a space launch system. And they ask me, can you talk about it? And I'm like, you can Google space launch system. NASA has a whole website on it.
But getting to Mars will require much more than a massive rocket.
You're gonna need a habitat while the crew is traveling to Mars. You're gonna need a Mars lander to land on Mars. You're gonna need a Mars ascent vehicle to get off of Mars. And then you're gonna need a way to get back home. So I would call it the most challenging mission in history.
Whether people today have the will to take on the risks and the hardships of going to Mars, as well as its massive costs, is an open question.
There's many activities we can spend our resources on, but why is space important? And we really are toying with the big questions. You know, are we alone? You know, why are we here? Is our planet unique? Those are big questions, and I think as a species, it's ingrained in us to try to answer those questions.
We'll go to Mars someday with man. It's going to happen. I think man's DNA is built on exploration, and he has to do it. So I think he'll eventually go.
Exploration is no longer driven by a global power struggle.
If it hadn't been for the Russians, you think we'd have got to the moon in the 60s? No way. Competition is an extremely important part of any human endeavor.